It's my pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's featured speaker, Dr. Gwynne Dyer. Dr. Dyer was born in St. John's, Newfoundland, and you will see his educational background in the program and on the screen. After graduating with his PhD in military and Middle Eastern history at King's College London, and after serving on the Naval Reserves of Canada, the UK, and the US, he lectured on military history and war studies at the Canadian Forces College in Toronto, and then at the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. In the late 1970s, he left his job as a lecturer to produce a 7-part radio series called 7 Faces of Communism for the CBC. This led to another radio series called War, which was then turned into a television series for the National Film Board, and hopefully many of you have seen that. War was telecast in 45 countries in the mid-'80s, and one episode was nominated for an Academy Award. He has continued to produce critically acclaimed work for radio and TV, such as The Defense of Canada, The Gorbachev Revolution, and The Human Race. Dr. Dyer's print journalism has been equally well received. His column on international affairs is published in over 175 papers in at least 45 countries. He has published several books, including Ignorant Armies, Sliding into War in Iraq, Future Tense, The Coming World Order, and most recently, Climate Wars, The Fight for Survival as the World Overheats, which was also a radio documentary for CBC. Like many great journalists, he is not only a storyteller, but a deeply engaged citizen whose work inspires readers, listeners, and viewers to be more alert, to ask more questions, and to become more active participants in society. This year, Dr. Dyer was appointed to the Order of Canada in recognition of his talents and service to Canada. The motto of the Order, translated, means they desire a better country. It is my pleasure to present Gwynne Dyer, who exemplifies this motto. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I think that annoyed a lot of people, that last thing. Good. I'm going to talk tonight about, you might say, the intersection between climate change and politics. Not domestic politics, but international politics. Because it seems to me that that's probably the largest piece of the equation that simply isn't on the table. And I first became aware of it about 3 years ago now. I was in Washington. I often go there because you got to go there to figure out what they're up to, you know. And when I go, I usually stay with an old friend who has spent his career, well, he actually did his PhD in British policy on the northwest frontier, you know, up by Afghanistan. So shortly after that, he got hired by the intelligence services, and he's done a whole career, right, in the intelligence services. And we were sitting around this flat one evening, and he dropped into the conversation the fact that the Pentagon, Joint Chiefs of Staff, to be precise, was getting interested in climate change. So I said, why? And he said, I don't know. But he gave me a couple of names, and they were actually people who worked for, I think it's called J5. Anyway, it's the cell within the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is, if you'll pardon the hyperbole, the brains of the Army. And these are sort of the long-range scenario mongers, the planning stuff. And yeah, they were working on this. And they were working on this under the administration of Mr. Bush. It was a career killer to be known to be interested in this in public. So they were doing it very quietly in the back room, but they were doing it. That's interesting. So I went back to London, and I began asking around in London circles, the military circles, Ministry of Defense circles I know, about the Brits, and by God, they're doing it too. In fact, that's where I first heard the phrase, Lifeboat Britain. And I'll skip ahead a long way and explain that phrase because I think it's what hooked me. What's being discussed quietly in Whitehall, in the British military, is this. If, and I would say when, the warming proceeds to the point where there are very serious global food shortages, and where the refugees are flowing north out of Africa, and they're beginning to flow north out of the Mediterranean as well, because the temperatures are intolerable and there are food shortages there, which are probably too great for the northern members of the European Union to cover. We don't want to be swamped, because the British Isles probably flat out farming every single piece of land that isn't actually vertical and eating not much meat could just about feed themselves if they don't let a lot of people in. Lifeboats get swamped if they let too many people aboard. And this phrase was the shorthand for a whole line of thinking that is beginning to occur within the British government, within the Ministry of Defence. You're dealing here with a government that thinks long term, right? We're not talking about Ottawa. And I can't detect any discussion of this matter in Ottawa at all. But yeah, so that phrase, I think more than anything else, got me going. Oh, there's something up here. And it's sort of up my alley now. So I began interviewing people, military people, particularly recently retired senior military people, because they're so grateful if somebody remembers they're still there. I mean, you know, you've had a driver for 20 years, and then suddenly not only are you taking your own car for a spin, but nobody phones and asks your opinion. So they're grateful if you do. And they will talk, but also talking to the scientists. I visited the Hadley Centre, which is the big British climate research centre, and the Boulder, Colorado, the National Center for Atmospheric Research in the States, and the Potsdam Institute, and I must have talked to a couple of dozen scientists whose names you might recognize. As I traveled around the world, because I sort of have a little 18-month round where you have to get to all of the major capitals at least, I put some people on the list to interview, generals and policymakers and scientists, and basically what I'm going to do this evening is tell you what I learned, what I know now that I didn't know at the start. And it will come in 4 packages. The first conclusion is that this is moving much faster than the public debate acknowledges. The public numbers, which we are all still using, are the numbers that were generated by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in 2007. Every 4 or 5 years, they get a couple of thousand scientists together. It's a UN-affiliated, sub-organization. And these scientists go review all the scientific peer-reviewed research that's been published since the last time they all met. It's sort of a year-long process. All the committees meet for a long time. And then they publish a report which is written for governments. People don't understand. These are not freelancers. This is paid for by governments, run by the UN, governments which actually don't want to hear very bad news. So there's this arm wrestle at the end between what the scientists want to say and what the governments are willing to let into the executive summary of the report, which is, of course, all the journalists ever read. So these are the numbers that we're working on. These numbers, which were, for example, the numbers used at the Copenhagen summit, that train wreck we had last December, are universally regarded by the scientists themselves as low. They are numbers that say that we're likely to see between 1.8 and 5.8 degrees Celsius higher average global temperature by the end of this century. Well, hell, it might only be 2 degrees, and we got 90 years to play with. I don't have to rush. Those are the public numbers. I don't think a single scientist I talked to believed those numbers. Partly because they know what the process was of basically haggling down the forecasts by government, and also the fact that all these committees work by consensus, the IPCC committees, so therefore basically the lowest common denominator is what gets into the report, but also because really, the data in the IPCC report are very old. Published in 2007, the committees met through 2006. None of the data, none of this peer-reviewed scientific reports is more recent than the end of 2005. That's when they imposed a cutoff date. They didn't want more stuff falling on the table every day as they worked through the process. So none of the data is newer than the end of 2005. But actually, if you think about it, we're talking published scientific research, right? So first of all, it had to go through a peer review process, which those of you who do this sort of thing for a living will be aware is not exactly rapid. Followed, unless you've got dynamite news, by a year's queue or more to get into the damn journal that you're publishing it in. So now we're back to 2003, and the question you now have to ask is, how old is the data? Because when they wrote the research up, they've already finished gathering their data set. So the data we're working with are 8, 9, 10 years old. The latest data in that published report, which is the basis of our public conversation. You look at what's been happening in the real world since 2006. For example, to Arctic ice cover, which crashed in 2006 to almost half of its previous minimum. And you come to different conclusions. And the real forecasts that people are working with, the ones that they draw up the scenarios for, are much more serious than this. The one that I found both most credible and most frightening was one that was produced by the Hadley Centre just before that conference in December of last year. Hadley Centre, it's in southwest England. It was opened, by the way, by Margaret Thatcher. It is only in North America that people who take climate change seriously are on the left and people who doubt it are on the right. In the rest of the world, it's not a left-right issue any more than gravity is. Margaret Thatcher was to the right of Attila the Hun, but she was a scientist. So the Hadley Centre, just before December, the Big Copenhagen, We're Going to Fix Everything summit, published a forecast of where they thought climate change warming would be in 2060. That is to say, 50 years down the road, not 90, 50. And they said higher average global temperature rise, 4 degrees Celsius average. Think about that for a minute. Where are we by the end of the century? Almost certainly way past the 6 degrees, which was the IPCC's end of century estimate. And then they published, together with that, a map of the world in which they showed what 4 degrees average global temperature means in terms of local temperature. Because, of course, 2/3 of the planet is covered with ocean. And the oceans are much cooler than the land surfaces of the planet. So that average isn't about what it feels like in Canada, particularly in central Canada. The map showed Britain getting off rather easily, actually. 4 degrees higher average global temperature. It's only 3 degrees higher in England because it's surrounded by ocean and it's rather a long way from the equator. And the closer you are to the equator, the more serious the impacts, though not necessarily. Well, that's too complicated to get into. Central Canada, Quebec, Ontario, the prairies, 7 degrees Celsius in 2060. On the coast here, 5.5. Are we still growing grain? I don't know. But you're pushing it. The Russians had 35 degrees all this summer, and they lost almost half their grain crop. So, much deeper water and flowing quite fast than we are discussing in public. Why would the number be so much higher? Because the Hadley Centre, in drawing up these numbers, did not just deal with the assumption that they all make, which is that we will continue to reduce our emissions at a rate that is inadequate to the problem. We will reduce our emissions. There will be electric cars or some kind of cars that don't run on petroleum fuel within 20 years in, large numbers. Sure there will, and that's a bit late, guys. And likewise, they aren't building any. Not one new coal-fired power station has been built in the United States in the last 2 years. Congratulations, Sierra Club. But there's hundreds of the things, and they'll be running for 30 years or so because that's their lifespan. Nobody's going to tear them down and replace them. So, yes, we'll cut our emissions, but we won't do it in time to prevent huge harm being done. So the assumption is that we will pass through the point of no return. The point of no return is 2 degrees Celsius higher. 450 parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, to put it in a more scientific phrasing. Everybody in the business reckons we're going to 500 or 550, if we're lucky, before we stop the rise. We're at 390 now. We were at about 280 at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So, it's kind of hard to stop this. It's a juggernaut. So there's that assumption. We're going past 250. When I say 450, 2 degrees, when I say that it's the point of no return, it's the point of no return in this specific sense that we lose control around 2 degrees hotter. Until then, it's our emissions that are causing the warming, so we can turn them off, at least in theory, if we choose, and thereby stop the warming. There's about a 20-year lag before turning them off stops the warming, but you can do it until you reach around 2 degrees. All of these numbers are fairly fuzzy, but what happens around 2 degrees is that the consequences of the warming trigger natural processes that contribute further to the warming, positive feedbacks as they are called, in which the permafrost melts and releases huge amounts of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, in which the surface waters of the oceans become so warm they can no longer contain all of the carbon dioxide they absorbed earlier. High school physics, right? Warmer water can contain less dissolved gas. Buy yourself a beer, and you'll see what I mean. If you don't drink it, it goes flat as it warms up. So all of those feedbacks kick in around 2 degrees, and then you've lost control, to the point where you may not be able to stop the warming process even if you stop all of your own emissions. So you're trapped on this escalator that's taking you up through 3, 4, 5, 6 degrees. 6 degrees is mass death. Higher average global temperature. Because, of course, it translates into a great deal more than that on the land surface of the planet. Mass death mainly from starvation, not from heat stroke, but mass death is mass death. So when the Hadley Centre put these numbers out, they were incorporating, which the IPCC does not, the early impacts of positive feedbacks, as well as just how much carbon dioxide will we put into the air by 2060. First time that had been done, but it gives you a really frightening number. And then they did the map, which is again something that's not normally done. And the consequence is we don't have a lot of time. We're in deep trouble. And the military know this. The military know this everywhere. It's well, except here. The people whose names you would recognize if you've been reading the literature, people like Jim Lovelock and Jim Hansen, the very serious scientist John Schellnhuber in Germany, people like that, they are flown in to the Pentagon to talk to people all the time. John Holdren, who's now Obama's science advisor, they talk to the Pentagon all the time. The Pentagon takes this very seriously. So we have a problem, Houston. And the reason the military become involved is because of the geopolitics of it. The damage does not occur equally across the planet. Countries closer to the equator are much harder hit than countries further away from the equator because the major impact is on the food supply. And it is in the tropics and the subtropics that we lose a lot of food production. I had no idea how much until I started looking into it. But it's really, the rule of thumb is that you lose 10% of global food production for every 1 degree Celsius higher average global temperature. The relationship may break down in the higher orders, but at 1, 2, 3, 4, that's what happens. That's a bit of a problem when you are pretty well stretched on feeding the existing almost 7 billion people, and you got another 1.5 billion or so coming before the population of the planet plateaus. And consumption's going up faster than population. As people get money in their genes, they're eating more meat. Even in India, they're eating more meat. And watch what happens to the prices of grain this fall as a result of half of the Russian grain crop being lost to heat and peat fires and so on. Well, I think 30%, but the number 50% is being bandied about. I mean, we had this 3 years ago, and we're likely to have it again. Grain prices may double. Right around and of course that means the poor starve, right? Rich never starve in food shortages. We ration by price. So food supply gets hit. If you want a thumbnail explanation of why it is in the tropics and the subtropics that the food supply gets hit, it's this. In the tropics, most of the major food crops, like rice, are not native to the tropics. They were domesticated in more temperate areas and then introduced into the tropics. They are very near the top of their temperature tolerance range in the tropics now, in normal times. Rice, corn, things like that. So give it just a couple of degrees warmer, which isn't asking a lot. You know you're going to get there. And frankly, you lose huge amounts of the crop in the tropics. The tropics actually, aren't going to see the kind of huge numbers in warming that are going to happen further away from the equator, but the only 2 degrees up. Rice, for example, will not germinate. Standard paddy lowland rice will not germinate if the temperature is above 35 degrees Celsius for even 24 hours during the key 3-week period when the grains of rice are fertilized, the little flowers are fertilized and form the grains of rice. Well, we're talking, look at Burma or Indonesia or something like that, it's 32, 33 all the time. So that's what happens in the tropics. In the subtropics, it's more a question of rainfall. The subtropics are a very rainfall short area anyway. You can usually get enough rain for one harvest a year, but nobody in the subtropics gets 2 or 3 harvests a year. And in the subtropics, the rain fails. By 50% it falls, or 75%. We're talking about the Mediterranean, both sides of it here. We're talking about Central America, Mexico, and the southern United States. The southern United States is the subtropics. Florida is the subtropics. South Texas is the subtropics. And, of course, almost all of Australia, all of southern Africa, significant part of South America, all closer to the equator. And so you're going to face major local food shortages and a global food shortage as a consequence of that. If you knock half the major rice exporters out of the equation, which this will do, then you have global food shortages as well. Lots of countries in the further north and further south parts of the planet can still feed themselves, but they are not exporting wheat anymore. Take, for example, Australia, which has just stopped. Second largest wheat exporter on the planet 10 years ago, but it is the canary in the coal mine. It's the driest continent. It's almost all in the subtropics, except the southern fringe. And they've just gone through what they thought was a drought. It's not a drought, it's climate change. It ain't ever going back. This is the new normal, guys. And as a result, Australia has exported almost no wheat for the last 2 or 3 years. They can still feed themselves. There's only 20 million of the buggers, but they aren't exporting wheat for that can be used to fill in the gaps elsewhere. And this will happen in a lot of places. So food becomes the critical issue, and the countries most impacted are tropical and subtropical, and this is where the geopolitics comes from, you see. So now we're getting into the second conclusion. The problems, the geopolitical problems that attract the attention of the military are refugees, failed states, and wars. All driven by food shortages. We haven't lived in a food scarcity world for 200 years. We have no idea what it's like. There's an anthropologist friend of mine, a guy called Steve LeBlanc. He runs the Peabody Museum in Harvard, who wrote a book once called Constant Battles about pre-civilized human beings and how they actually lived. Not the fantasy version where they lived in, the Garden of Eden and wore flowers in their hair. But the real ancient world where food shortages, including ones that you could die from, were a regular occasion. And his rule of thumb is people always raid before they starve. Raid the neighbors. No, doesn't automatically, inevitably follow that large civilized society will do the same as small hunter-gatherer bands, but it's the same people, So the military think that there's going to be a lot of work for them. I mean, I can't discern, and I don't see how you would separate their motives into the good ones, they just want to be ready to deal with trouble, and the bad ones, they're looking for a justification for their existing budget, and the present justifications are getting a bit thread-worn, so we need some new ones. I can be quite cynical about this on occasion, but I have taken my pills today. But they're right. You talk to the U.S. military, for example, their, I'd say, obsession in the planning, not your average grunt or his, section platoon officer, but in the thinking parts of the military, the obsession is Mexico. Because there's a 2,000-mile, 3,000 kilometers, I'm in Canada, 3,000-kilometer border between Mexico and the United States. There are 100 million people in Mexico and another 50 million south of them in Central America. The farms there are going to dry up and blow away. There's already a well-established pattern when you're in deep trouble and you can't feed your family, head north. There is an existing arrangement on the U.S. border which might be described as catch some and let some go. It's not really fortified. It looks pretty impressive in the cities where people can see it, but if you drive 10, 15 kilometers out of town, east or west along the border, you're down to 3 strands of barbed wire at a dirt patrol track with a vehicle down it every 4 hours. It is actually meant to allow lots of people to get through, because cheap, illegal labor is what keeps American agro-business profitable. And the reason that it's cheap is because the workers are illegal and they can't bargain. So there is a reason for all this, though not one we can speak of in front of the children. This provides a safety valve for the Mexican state. It provides cheap labor for American farmers. And, you know, the flow is maybe 500,000 a year, 1 million a year, and half of them go home again after the harvest. We can deal with that. There's 300 million people in the United States. Drop in the bucket. But try 5 million a year, because the things have fallen apart and there's no food in Mexico. What do you do at 5 million a year? Well, the U.S. Army is convinced that the Congress will tell them to close that border. Really close it. And they can do that. It's absolute nonsense, though you'll hear it often enough in the States to go, ooh, I don't know, 2,000 miles of border, we could never shut that. Bullshit. Iron Curtain. Do you remember the Iron Curtain? But the dirty secret is that you can only shut a border if you're willing to kill people. An exemplary few hundred will generally do, but you actually have to be willing to kill people. And, you know, I reckon the U.S. Army is probably willing to do that because, you know, they don't have an ingrained philosophical objection, certainly, to killing people. But they do understand that actions have consequences. I mean, these are serious people. And they do understand, as several of them said to me, that if we are killing people on the border, killing Mexicans, killing Central Americans on the border who are trying to get through, that will get, you know, everybody's got cameras now, including video cameras, even if it's just the phone one. And so this is going to be up on the web and maybe up on the evening news, and 20% of the resident U.S. population, most of them perfectly legal citizens, will be of recently arrived Mexican or Central American descent when this happens. And how are they going to feel about us shooting their distant relatives at the border? One officer said to me, I reckon this could cause the gravest social divisions in the United States since the American Civil War. So it does get complicated. That's what they're thinking. Refugees is the major issue that obsesses the Americans. It obsesses the Europeans, and I sort of trailed that a little bit with the Lifeboat Britain idea. The European Union, it's quite interesting. You go to Brussels, the capital of the European Union, such as it is, and there's one particular kind of conversation which can only occur when the Spanish and the Italians and the Greeks and Portuguese aren't present. So it takes place in the corridors or in the pubs. And it is this rather desultory conversation at this point in the proceedings, but people kicking ideas around about what do we do when these are all not just food deficit areas, but areas that we can't even supply with enough food to keep them going. You're talking about a lot of people here. Right? 100 million plus. I mean, everybody knows this is coming. I was in the Netherlands recently, and they're planning to raise the level of that sort of inland sea they've got, the Zuiderzee, by 1.5 meters. And there's various reasons, hydrological reasons for doing that, but they figured out what to do with the extra water. They're going to sell it to Spain. Serious. This is part of the Delta Commission's, the Dutch Delta Commission's planning. So everybody knows bad things are going to happen in Southern Europe, and the problem is that at the moment there's freedom of movement within the European Union. You're Italian, you want to move to Sweden and open up a plant or a shop or whatever, you can do it. Nobody can tell you not to. A few forms to fill out, but no permissions required. You want to just travel there, nobody even looks at a passport. There aren't any passports on most passport checks, any checkpoints at all on most internal European borders anymore. So at the moment, all those people could move north. But, you know, while Northern Europeans quite like Italians, and it's nice to have 1 million or 500,000 around, who wants 5 million or 10? And the answer is nobody. I mean, you know, if the shoe were on the other foot, the Italians wouldn't want them either. In fact, the Italians don't want the Africans that are coming in at the bottom end. So that means that at some point down the road, and this is the conversation you can't have when the subjects are present, we're going to have to stop free movement in Europe. We're going to have to stop the freedom of Southern Europeans to move to Northern Europe. Does this mean we have to divide into sort of what used to be the European Union north of the Alps and something else below it? Don't know. But that's the kind of conversation that's going on. Yes, the Australians have just doubled the size of the Navy they deploy off their north coast because they anticipate refugee flows south out of Indochina, Indonesia, the Philippines. I keep talking to the South Africans about this, but they've got so much on their minds. But the same issue, the only industrialized country and the only country with some temperate zone in all of Africa has open borders at the moment. And 5 million foreigners living in a country of 45 million people. That could go to 45 million if things get really rough further north. So that's the sort of thing that's going through people's minds. Refugees as a first, and refugees who may have to be stopped by force. So there's that. Then, what happens to the governments of the places they're trying to get away from? No government that cannot feed its population survives. Not for long. So we're talking failed states. We're talking a proliferation of failed states, particularly across Africa and large parts of the Middle East, which is where it will be worst. Africa gets absolutely hammered by this because almost all of Africa, except the Western Cape actually, is either in the tropics or the subtropics. There is no other, apart from the Western Cape, there's no temperate zone. Well, very high bits of Kenya and so on. There's no temperate zone. So, you can expect failed states, as well as the refugee flows. And then, jackpot, on river systems shared by numbers of countries, war is virtually inevitable at some point. Because the upriver states will keep more than their agreed share, or will demand a larger share if that's not what they already have. When there's not enough water to go around, if you have a way of diverting it into your irrigation system, you do it. It's starting up on the Nile now. The old agreements on the Nile have been repudiated by the upstream states. And they're setting up a sort of alternative Nile Valley organization that excludes Egypt and Sudan, the major downstream beneficiaries now. I think Turkey and Iraq would be at war today if Iraq wasn't flat on its back and incapable of fighting anybody, because the Turks have built 12 huge dams in eastern Turkey, and they are using those dams to irrigate eastern Turkey. The rivers in question are the Tigris and the Euphrates, the two rivers that define Mesopotamia. There's virtually no water in the Euphrates. It's not reaching the point where the rivers used to join, just north of Basra. Hasn't done all of this summer. So agriculture is basically shut down in western Iraq this summer. Now, at the moment there's still an international grain market, and Iraq's got a lot of money because it's got oil. But in a time when the Iraqi state was not flat on its back, I think there'd be a war over this. There will, at some point, almost certainly, be a war between India and Pakistan over it. Works like this. Pakistan is Egypt at 3 times the scale. It depends almost entirely on the waters of the Indus. It's the largest irrigated area in the world. 85% of Pakistan's food comes from the Indus River and the land irrigated from the Indus River, which of course doesn't reach the sea anymore. They take all water out of it. But 5 of the 6 tributaries of the Indus River flow through India or Indian-controlled Kashmir before they reach Pakistan. Now, there is a treaty, it's 50 years old this year, on the division of the waters between the two countries. The Pakistanis always figure they got gored by it, but at the moment they actually do get about 70% of the total flow. India only gets 30%. It gets all of the flow in the 3 eastern tributaries, which are much smaller, and it gets an allotted share of the flow, which it can take out upstream itself, of the flow in 2 of the 3 tributaries that Pakistan owns. But that share is defined not as a share, a proportion of what's there, but as a fixed volume of water. Now, it turns out to be about 30% of current flow. But those rivers, and certainly the Pakistani ones, are glacier-fed. And the glaciers are melting. They're going, according to the Chinese Academy of Sciences, at 7% a year. So, they'll all be gone in 20 years. And what you can look forward to is 20 years of flooding. You notice it has been flooding rather in Pakistan at the moment. That's largely to do with the monsoon, but it's also more flow than you wanted. So 20 years of flooding, and then after that, when the glaciers are all gone, the rivers are half empty in the summer, because that's what keeps them full in the summer. It doesn't rain in the summer up there, the headwaters. So, not enough water to go around, not enough water for anybody, but the problem is India is still entitled to take a fixed volume of water out of the rivers that belong to Pakistan. And do you think it's going to go, oh shucks, this isn't fair? We should take less and only take, an equivalent proportion to what we used to take when the river was full. So it was 30% then. We'll go down to 30% of what's left now. Sure, they will say that. India is a democracy, but that means it's answerable to the public. No Indian politician could say that and survive. I mean, India's going to have its own problems. I was in New Delhi not that long ago, and I was interviewing the head of a think tank there, who's run by a woman whose husband is the head of the Planning Commission, which is a super powerful body in New Delhi. They're kind of a tag team, they play very rough. But she dropped into the conversation almost by the way, that she just finished doing a contract for the World Bank, which had asked her to figure out how much agricultural production India lost at 2 degrees Celsius higher average global temperature. So you figure out average local, and then, how much rainfall you got left, and come back and tell me how close you are to feeding yourself at 2 degrees higher average global temperature. So she put her people on it, they did all the due diligence, and they went back and reported that India loses 25% of its food production at 2 degrees higher. So is India going to be in the mood to cut a little slack to poor old Pakistan? Doubt it. Pakistanis are starting to starve. Both of these countries have nuclear weapons, and people always raid before they starve. That's the sort of thing that we're looking at here. The deeper into this process we go, the higher the likelihood that this sort of event will become commonplace. So it's not just a deadline you mustn't pass 450 parts per million. It's a deadline you mustn't get so deep into the process that countries are fighting each other or not talking to each other or falling into failed state status. Because after that, no deals are possible. You're not even talking to each other anymore. Conclusion 3. We're going to go through the point of no return and probably a good deal further in terms of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Almost certain. We are at 395, actually, at the moment, parts per million. And before the current recession cut the growth rates a little bit, we were growing at 3 parts per million a year in our emissions. Mainly now due to the rapidly industrializing countries of the third world who are having to increase their power generation capacity by 10, 12% a year. We're not doing that here. We're replacing old generating capacity with new generating capacity on a 40-year turnover basis. But it's there that all the new stuff's going in. Don't blame them. We put our stuff in earlier. We did the same job. But now it's them. So do the maths. We're at 395. Mustn't go past 450. 55 divided by 3 tells you when you've passed the point of no return. Not a happy thought, is it? And can you really believe that we're going to get the politics of this right enough to bring that down steeply in the next 20 years? Get ahead of the curve? I don't know anybody who believes it. Which is why there is this undercurrent of panic in a lot of the conversations, in fact, most of the conversations that you have with the scientists. They cannot see how we are going to avoid going past the point of no return, where we lose control, where the feedbacks kick in, which is what, of course, Hadley Centre was talking about, or partly what it was talking about when it gave us that 4 degrees in 2060 forecast. I have children, I have grandchildren. I am not tremendously pleased by this news. And there is maybe a way to cheat. And that is geoengineering, which could get you lynched if you mentioned it in scientific circles 3 or 4 years ago. It was absolutely taboo to talk about geoengineering, direct interference in the climate system in order to hold temperature down and not go through that 2 degrees Celsius point of no return. It was regarded as absolutely grounds for expulsion from the community to talk about that in public, in front of the children, us, the great unwashed, on the grounds that we were bound to get the wrong end of the stick here and say, oh, so we don't have to cut our emissions, we can just hold the temperature down. Well, no, of course you can't do that. You've got to get your emissions down. The acidification of the oceans continues. All sorts of other nasty effects of large amounts of carbon dioxide and methane going into the atmosphere continue. And of course, with every year that passes, the difference between whatever temperature you've engineered and the real temperature you will immediately inherit if you stop engineering gets bigger and bigger. So you have to cut your emissions. But you could win another 20 or 30 years to get your emissions down without paying the horrendous penalties you will pay by going through 2 degrees if you can geoengineer. And somewhere around 2 years ago, it began to turn in scientific circles, and people who previously would not talk in public about this stuff began to talk about it in public on the grounds that this is the only way we have any chance of getting through this without taking huge casualties. Nobody's talking about the human race disappearing. Nobody's talking about the death of life on Earth. We're talking about hitting a temperature that we haven't seen on this planet for 35 million years. But actually, 6 degrees hotter. We've been there before. The Earth's fine. The Earth system's fine. The only problems are that all the tropics and the subtropics and a good deal of the temperate zone is open desert. And the only really suitable zones for life are around the poles down below the Arctic Circle, but not that far south of the Arctic Circle, which is why if you go back to that period geologically and you do the digging, you find crocodiles living on Baffin Island. They're in the dark half the year, but that's where there's living going on. So, and there'd be human beings left at 6 degrees warmer, but I really don't think there'd be too many. So if you don't want that, you'd better start thinking, and you don't believe that we can shut down the growth in emissions fast enough. If you can believe that, do it, but have a plan B, and plan B is geoengineering. The first man to go public with it was a fellow called Paul Crutzen, about 2.5, 3 years ago now. Very serious dude. He got the Nobel Prize as an atmospheric chemist for his work on the ozone hole. So he knows about the upper atmosphere quite a lot, and it was he who said, look, we need a plan B here. And plan B is that we try to mimic what volcanoes do. When a big volcano explodes, it pushes very large amounts of gas and ash into the stratosphere. Small volcanoes just get into the lower atmosphere, the troposphere, but a big one will push a megaton of this stuff up into the stratosphere where it spreads around the planet, is fully distributed in a few weeks' time because of the upper altitude winds. And it stays in the stratosphere for a long time because there's no weather up there. You're above the weather. There's no rain. It doesn't wash out. On average, the stay time's about 2 years. And most of the gas is sulfur dioxide. And with sunlight hitting it in the upper atmosphere, the sulfur dioxide rapidly turns into tiny droplets of sulfuric acid, which reflect lots of incoming sunlight. And that sunlight doesn't reach the Earth's surface, and therefore you have a cooling effect at the surface. When Mount Pinatubo exploded in 1991, the last big volcano in the Philippines, we had 1/2 degree Celsius average global temperature lower for the following 2 years. Also gorgeous sunsets. So we could do that artificially. We could put enough sulfur dioxide up there to hold the temperature down by reflecting sunlight in the stratosphere. They've figured out how to do it. There's several proposals on the table for how to do it. But the one that sounds likeliest is that you simply use the same mid-air refueling aircraft that the Air Forces already own, and you fit them with tanks that can hold pressurized gas instead of aviation fuel, and you fly them up to the stratosphere, one enormous fart as you let all the sulfur dioxide out, and then you back down to the ground for another load. A dozen of those planes operating 3 sorties a day, and you've got enough up there to bring this temperature globally down by 1 degree Celsius in a year. Then you're going to have to replenish it from time to time, but not continuously. It stays up there for quite a while. So, Crutzen put this proposal on the table. Well, he was ostracized. He took so much stick. I saw him recently, and he's okay. He's talking publicly again. But for about 2 years, he just shut down. He wouldn't answer his phone. He was getting death threats. He was being disinvited from scientific conferences. He'd really overstepped the then bounds of the conversation. Where I saw him 5 months ago, however, was a conference in California of 200 scientists who are working very seriously on geoengineering, and they're all out of the closet. And this conference wasn't even about geoengineering techniques, it was about the governance of geoengineering research and deployment. In the Asilomar Center in Monterey, which is where the gene splicers held their very similar conference to write the rules 30 years ago. Don't let Congress write the rules. You do the template, Congress will pass it. So, now there's lots of geoengineering proposals on the table. Another one, which actually I find rather more attractive, it's a guy called John Latham, who's in the National Centre for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, but he's actually a retired British professor who they snapped up when he took his retirement. His idea is that you build a fleet of unmanned satellite-directed, wind-powered vessels that sail around the oceans in little fleets with maybe a kilometer separation, 50 or 100 of them, a kilometer separation, and they position themselves below the low-lying cloud that covers a very large amount of the oceans. It actually covers about a quarter of the oceans at any given time. It's called marine stratocumulus cloud. It's almost like having ground fog above your head. You know, it forms and dissipates. You can often see the sun through it, though it's still there. But it does. It reflects about 50% of incoming sunlight that hits the top layer of this cloud is bounced back into space. So it's a major cooling factor in the Earth's climate. Anyway, his idea is you spray a fine mist of seawater up into the air from these vessels, and you don't blast it up to 100 meters. You get it 10 meters in the air, and turbulence will carry half of it up into the clouds, where the moisture will stick. It will thicken the clouds. They will reflect more sunlight and produce a heating effect, a cooling effect, a greater cooling effect at the surface. Well, that's a little bit better than poisoning the stratosphere, isn't it? And it's a lot easier to turn off, too. There's a number of other proposals around, but I'll just tell you one more. This was a guy, well, he's the chief, I know he's the chief scientist at NASA's research facility in Virginia, Langley, Virginia. And an old friend of mine, and he emailed me at Christmas last year saying, we've crunched the numbers, and we figure we could get 1 degree Celsius of cooling average worldwide just by painting all the roads and the roofs white. Sounds a little bit Rube Goldberg, I admit, but the U.S. Energy Secretary, Stephen Chu, announced that in March. You know, quick and dirty, one time only, but you know, you need a degree and you need it now, get your paintbrushes out. The common denominator in all of these geoengineering proposals, and there are more, is this. They're cheap. They're not ultra expensive. This is not the moonshot. This is not building pyramids. They costed out how much it would take to deploy a dozen mid-air refueling aircraft. You're not building them from scratch. You borrow them from the Air Force. 3 sorties a day for a year. And the answer is a couple of $1 billion. Hey, chicken feed. What government doesn't have a couple of $1 billion? So anybody can do this. Even some rich individuals could do it, but we probably stop them. How do you stop a government? And this brings me to my final point. It's sort of boxes within boxes. This may be the gravest source of conflict. Because there are some countries that are going to want to geoengineer a lot earlier than others, because they're in deep trouble now. If you're Bangladeshi, and you're standing up to your knees in water and starving at the same time, when you want to geoengineer is right now. And I don't care about your reservations, scientific or otherwise. I don't care that it still feels okay in Canada. We want this fixed now. Perfectly reasonable position, I would have said. But a possible source of international conflict of a very grave order. I talked actually to the head of the Bangladesh Institute of Strategic Studies about this. You didn't even know that existed, did you? Well, there is one. It's quite serious, run by a general, bright guy. I said, have you heard about geoengineering? And he smiled seraphically. And he said, yes. Your question? And I asked the question, do you think that this is something the Bangladesh government might want to do a little bit before, let's say, the U.S. government or the Chinese government? He said, yes, it has crossed our minds. And then he stopped talking, obviously. You don't need to. I beg for trouble. But that is Now I'm willing to bet that the debate about geoengineering, now that the scientists are all out of the closet, is going to take over in a big way in about a year or two when they make their first requests for permission to do open-air, small-scale experiments. And the phrase that you're going to hear, I promise also, I'm pretty sure of this, that you're going to hear a lot. It will become part of the common parlance is SRM, which is the collective, short, what's the word I'm looking for here? For God's sake, not anagram, not analog, but acronym. Thank you. Solar Radiation Management, SRM, is what covers all of these various geoengineering proposals. It's going to be out in public soon. It's going to be ferociously divisive. There will be people who say, we've already screwed up the atmosphere with inadvertent interventions. Now you're proposing to fix it with further interventions? Leave it alone. But the answer is then we get 6 degrees. So there will be an argument. I think I know which side of it I'm on, although I'd really rather we didn't have to go at each other's throats about it. And the arguments may, in due course and over a longer period of time, develop into conflicts. I mean, this is deeply worrisome and divisive stuff. And now I'm finished, except to say this. I am more optimistic now than I was when I started this. And you may wonder why or how I could be. But you see, I've talked to several hundred people in various capacities, but all of them in fairly with senior responsibilities, who are working at finding a way through this, or various bits of it. And while every single one of them is a fallible human being, they're well informed, they're serious, they're trying quite hard. And I think there are ways through this. I will not quote the odds on our being able to find them and take them, but there are ways through this which would involve not losing billions of people. A higher promise than that I cannot give you. This is going to be one hell of a ride. But I think there are ways that we can do this. I mean, the ideal is that the world's population peaks around 8.5 billion in the 2050s. It's most of the way there by the 2030s. And then it begins a gradual descent, and by the end of the century we're back down to 7 billion or less. And you just have to extrapolate current trends and you get that. We don't have to do anything particularly, just wait for it to happen. But in that whole trajectory, which dips down maybe in the mid-22nd century to where we ought to be, somewhere around 3 billion or no more anyway, that at no point in the process is there mass death kills 1 billion people. No big nuclear war, no famine, Holocaust-scale famine that devastates a continent. That would be nice. I'd settle for that.
Assuming there are still people left in the other 2 rooms and they haven't run out and committed suicide, Dr. Dyer is going to take questions in those 2 rooms briefly, and then we'll return to this room.
Have you had a chance to chat to the strategic planners in China?
Have I chatted to the strategic planners in China? Yes, I have, the recently retired ones. And they're actually, the Chinese are tremendously serious about China, climate change, and the fallout from it, because the forecasts for China itself are pretty terrifying. And they've got a real problem, which is you've got to keep the lights on, and the economy's growing 11% a year, so that's a lot of new powers you've got to install. They're putting in all the wind they can, they're putting in nuclear, they're putting in everything else, but it's still mostly coal. I mean, the 2 industrialized or semi-industrialized countries that use the highest proportion of coal are China and the United States, by far. 60% of power generation. So, they're scared to death, but they have to go on putting the coal-fired stations, because if the lights go out, the regime goes down. You know, you got to keep the goose laying the golden eggs, or you're toast. You, the Communist Party, the current regime in China. That's their perception, I think correct. So, on the one hand, they are very scared, and on the other hand, they keep on doing things that make the crash more likely, because when the warming gets to 2 degrees, they lose, according to a contract which was made at the same time as one with India by the World Bank. Of course, the World Bank's hiding all these contracts. It won't admit it ever made them. And the one that they made with China was stuck up on a website leaked by somebody for a couple of days, then taken down. Everybody denies it was ever there, but I know it was there. Because the equivalent figure of how much agricultural production does China lose at 2 degrees higher is 38%. Now, 38% loss of food is Civil War and revolution. I mean, nothing short. So the Chinese are very scared. They're very serious about this, but they cannot make a deal until the Americans are aboard. And really, the deal they make cannot require that they stop growing their economy as fast as they possibly can, because that's the one way the regime survives.
There are situations occurring in other northern peripheries.
What's my perspective on the difficulties Canada's experiencing over sovereignty claims in the Arctic areas and other similar possibilities? I think that this is vastly overdone. The one really worrisome confrontation over seabed issues, demarcation of the seabed, now that the ice is melting and it may be accessible for drilling for gas and oil, was between Russia and Norway. Well, they signed an agreement in Moscow last week, which regulates the seabed border between Russia and Norway, which is, of course, a NATO member. When I was in Moscow a year ago, people could talk a little else with the possible confrontation with NATO over that seabed dispute. It's over. As for Canada, who are we going to have a dispute with, apart from the Americans, but I presume that won't turn armed. There is a dispute over the seabed demarcation where the Yukon meets Alaska, and that is also thought to be an area that might have petrochemicals on the seabed. But, you know, you cut a deal in the end. That's how you fix this stuff. As far as the Northwest Passage is concerned and our sovereignty over that, it's really the Americans that dispute our sovereignty, not the Russians or somebody. And in any case, I don't believe the Northwest Passage is ever going to be a viable artery for large-scale commerce. Why? Because it's very narrow and twisty, and the prevailing winds in the Arctic Ocean push an awful lot of sea ice into that area. If there's any left, that's where you'll find it. And there is a Northeast Sea Passage, the Northern Sea Route around northern Russia, which will get you from the Atlantic to the Pacific just as quickly, cut just as much off the journey time. It's got good infrastructure all the way along, including nuclear-powered icebreakers, and it's already open. They run ships through it last year and this year. Why would anybody... no insurer is ever going to pay for a ship to cover a ship going through the Northwest Passage if it isn't double hull. There will always be some ice there. So it's the Northeast Passage gets tonight. This is all about, chest beating and sovereignty and sort of whipped up issues to get the roots worried.
Yeah. Can I imagine Canada becoming a recipient of climate refugees if this situation develops as I outlined? Of course. Our problem's the Americans. There are going to be, certainly, Americans displaced within their own country. South Florida is a goner sooner or later from sea level rise. You only need I was talking to the chief hydrological engineer of Dade County in Miami when I was down there speaking recently, and I asked him, how much sea level rise will do you? And he said, 0.5 meter. Whoa. Because Miami is built on very porous rock, and the seawater will infiltrate. There'll be no water source within 100 miles.
that you can use. It'll all be sold. This is before you get inundated. So, yeah, there will be internal refugees. The United States, first of all, the southwest and parts of the deep south of the United States are actually in the subtropics. You notice Georgia is regularly getting droughts already, very big ones. Never used to happen. Always rained in Georgia, not anymore. But also there's a major danger with even small sea level rise. We're not looking at huge sea level rise in this century, maximum. Well, what the Dutch are calculating is between 3/4 of a meter and 1.5 meters. That's the assumptions on which they are reinforcing their dikes, and I take the Dutch seriously. On that basis, you don't lose a huge amount of coastline in most places, though you do lose southern Florida. But right up the U.S. East Coast, there are a series of bays, of very large estuaries, which face southeast and narrow as you go up towards the top. And up towards the top, there is Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. And what will happen, all you need is a big autumn hurricane whacking in there at high tide with a little bit of sea level rise. Sort of spring tide, high tide, and give us a 0.5 meter sea level rise, and you're up to your knees in water on the mall in Washington. So you're looking at American refugees, certainly internal American refugees. I've had discussions with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers about the resettlement of American refugees. But yes, there are certainly Americans casting lascivious eyes upon our territory. And we're going to have to figure out some kind of deal. I would much rather ship water south than have Americans ship north. That is a better option to me, and it is a viable option for a long time. The ones who are displaced, to a large extent, will be displaced because you can't grow food here anymore, and loss of rainfall in the southwest, the midwest, and then the internal refugees from flooding and hurricanes in South Florida and so on. But by and large, if you can keep the people fed where they are, they'd rather stay where they are. So can we just ship the water south instead? I know I'm trampling on a Canadian nationalist shibboleth here, but circumstances do alter cases. And I think it's time to reconsider the traditional flat Canadian refusal to discuss selling them our water. You don't have, you better not find yourself in a situation where you have no control about how much you sell or how it gets from here to there. But if they're desperate enough, they'll be willing to go beyond the current NAFTA treaty. And I would like to see that done. Basically, give them what they want, because before they're so desperate, they kick the door in. Yeah, but the problem is, the Chinese aren't going to stay poor. The Indians are not going to. Nobody's going to volunteer to stay poor to save our bacon. And if they don't stay poor, then their economies continue to grow and their emissions continue to grow. And we get to 450 pretty fast.
There's no deal in the works at all.
Well, people will go on trying to make a deal. I hope they succeed. I shall support, not that it matters, every effort they make. But do I really believe they're going to make a deal that's radical enough to change outcomes in terms of hitting 450 in 20, 25 years' time? I don't think so. And I talked to a lot of people who are involved in the negotiations. I know what would be required, so do they, and they know it's not going to be forthcoming. Okay, so what are you going to do about this? Wait and take it? Or try to avoid what is the worst for the human race? It doesn't matter to the Earth. The Earth will be fine. There's a book out now, a very interesting one, called The Earth Without Us. And it would still be here. We're not indispensable, we're not even desirable in some people's view. But I find this rather desirable because I happen to be one of us. I'm not talking about saving the planet. It's a totally wrong way of phrasing the task. It's saving ourselves.
Simple idea. Cut emissions, decade?
Oh yeah, look, there are lots of things we can do to slow the warming, including things, like planting trees and all the rest of it, that will take carbon dioxide out of the air. Now you have to watch where you plant the trees. It doesn't help much in the high Arctic or the boreal forest, but it helps a lot in the tropical forest. In the long run, we've got to get this carbon dioxide we're putting into the air back out of it. Unless you want to geoengineer forever, assuming geoengineering works, at some point, once you've gone to 550, you've got to get back down to 450. In fact, you probably should go to 350, which is where we were in about the 60s. I feel a lot better. How do you do that? And the answer is you put back a lot of what you destroyed, including the tropical forest. You can get 50 parts per million out of the atmosphere just by letting the tropical forest, the half of all the tropical forests that we cut down over the last 2 centuries, let them grow back. You don't actually even have to replant them, just let them grow back. And there are other ways of getting more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Anything you can do helps. But the task is A, not to go through 450, and B, if you have, but you're still around because you're geoengineering and enormous catastrophes have so far been averted, how do you get back down below 450? And there's a wide variety. Cut your emissions, find ways of soaking up the carbon dioxide you put in the atmosphere. It's all part of there's no single magic bullet here. The range of things we might be doing grows wider every year as new ideas are, cause algal blooms in the ocean by fertilizing the surface with iron powder. I don't believe that one really, but it's another idea that's out there. And the algal blooms will absorb large amounts of carbon dioxide as they grow, and then they'll carry it to the sea bottom and get sequestered. So the story goes. All of that is going to come on the table, and a lot of it will need to be done.
I think that the tar sands are in deep, deep trouble, and I talked to the Alberta government about it. I mean, they're not complete idiots. They do understand they've got a problem in Alberta, and they are thinking desperately how they might solve the problem without having to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. And I don't think they're going to find one, but I wish them well. I mean, what they're doing at the moment is thinking more about how do we get the public heat off than how do we actually solve the problem. So, for example, you can see the Americans moving towards banning oil that has a higher well-to-wheels, as they say, carbon emission profile than American conventionally produced oil. There's already legislation in place from 2007 which bans U.S. government vehicles from buying oil that doesn't fit that law. And California's got very similar legislation going through right now, and that's 1/6 of the vehicles in the United States. So, scrambling to change the profile of Alberta oil so it sneaks in under those new rules is a very high priority, which is why they are now talking about putting nuclear power in on the Peace River in northern Alberta, so that rather than burn natural gas to get the oil out of the sand, you burn uranium, and therefore you bring your carbon profile down, because the current problem is a lot of it is, apart from settling ponds and things, the problem is you're burning about 2 barrels of oil to get equivalent in natural gas to get 3, which ultimately will be burned again. So 2 plus 3 equals 5 for the benefit from 3. And this, outrages a lot of people. The numbers may be wrong because they are actually state secrets. I mean, you go looking for them, and I've done this, what is the actual emissions profile of Alberta oil, of tar sands oil? And I won't say oil sands, I know what they are. That's just PR again. the actual emissions profile is a secret. The Alberta government will, rather like the Israelis over nuclear weapons, neither confirm nor deny. Sir, right in the front here.
My
question is, which political party or movement will persuade Western populations that we can't go on as we are going and that living standards must be reduced? I don't think there is any. I know, I'm serious about this because I have thought about it, and there is a whole strand of thinking which is taken seriously by many people and wistfully by many more, which says, we wouldn't be in this pickle if we only lived lightly upon the planet. Actually, that was true 60 years ago, when there was only 2 billion of us. We could live on tiptoe, all of us, now, and we'd still weigh too much because there's almost 7 billion of us. So living lightly on the planet, even if we all could be persuaded to do that, simply postpones the day when the roof falls in. And perhaps not by very much. Curbing our emissions, changing the way we use energy, and doing a lot of other things like, restoring some of the land, particularly marginal for agricultural purposes, to its original natural state, which allows it to be part of the system, the global ecosystem, self-maintaining, self-regulating, that we have tampered with and diminished greatly over the last couple of centuries. All that's good stuff. But I do not imagine that we're going to solve this problem by living lightly. Partly because I don't believe that the vast majority of the world's population is ready to buy into that, but even if it were, there's too many of us. So what we have to do is a different kind of living lightly. It's not living lightly by reducing consumption. It is radically changing the ways we produce energy and the ways we produce food. And the latter will probably take longer than the former. But we've got to give about half the agricultural land back to nature if we expect natural systems to serve us in the long run. We can't go on treating, sort of strip mining the oceans. We have got to create reserves where fish populations can generate. We have to stop burning fossil fuels. Full stop, not diminish, stop. Entirely. And the happy news is that if you do that, you can go on living in a high-energy civilization. There's nothing wrong with energy. It's how you generate it. And frankly, we are not going to survive as 7 billion people in anything but a high-energy society. How do you think we do our agriculture these days? You're eating oil. Lady right here. The Netherlands is planning for between a third and 3/4 of a meter and a meter and a half of sea level rise in this century. The IPCC figures a maximum of half a meter, but as usual comes in way low from what real experts are looking at when they're not being censored by government. I would say that for Canada, it's a lesser problem than almost anywhere else. You look at our coasts, they're pretty steep too. But for some places, it's a death sentence. Bangladesh, the Nile Delta, good deal of, South Florida, so on. But sea level rise is actually, although it gets a lot of attention, is really one of the least of our 21st century problems. In the end, it becomes a huge problem. But it takes a long time for a lot of ice to melt. And I think that other things will get us a lot earlier than sea level rise. Okay, there's two gentlemen right at the back standing up, and the one in the red sweater, red T-shirt gets it. I mean, is there one key? No, of course there's not. There's many different ways of skinning this cat. But I would say that the most important thing is that you actually charge the real energy cost. Do not allow anybody to externalize their costs. Okay? If we were paying the full environmentally accounted price for fossil fuel energy, we wouldn't be using any. Because at that point, it would take, we would as long as it took to get out of it, but get out of it in a hurry and go to anything else. Solar, wind, you name it, tidal. I'm okay with nuclear, but I don't think it's going to fly because it just takes too long and costs too much. I think it faces the same problems that fossil fuels do, just in terms of the enormous cost of doing it if you don't externalize. Now, it doesn't produce carbon dioxide, so you don't have those costs, except in the construction phase. But it's just a very, very expensive way of producing energy. Give me really efficient fusion power, and I'll take it. But I'm not there yet. And we probably will be there in 50 years, but we got to get through this 50 years first. So get out of fossil fuels, and the way you do that is by forcing an accountancy regime on them that compels them to charge the real price. That's all you have to do to change the equation. It doesn't solve everything, but it's the major thing you need to do. If you can find a way to do that, I'll kiss your boots. Right over here, sir. Okay, the so-called clean coal, is that a possibility or not? I don't think it is it's a technological possibility. No question about it. You can do that. Sequester, carbon capture and sequestration, scrub the carbon dioxide out of the exhaust flue and bury it underground in, sort of salt cap, sort of various underground reservoirs that will keep it there forever or a significant portion of forever. Well, yes, but it costs a lot. And that is why, and here's an interesting fact, we've been hearing about carbon capture and storage, clean coal, from coal industry for now about 15 years. And actually every year or so, they announce that they're going to do a pilot plant on a full industrial scale in Europe or in America with great fanfare, and then it's canceled quietly about a year later. But don't worry, because there'll be another announcement of a new pilot plant along any time now. The game that's being played, and we should not have allowed ourselves to be fooled so long, the coal industry knows how much carbon capture and storage would cost. They know that their power plants will not be economically competitive if they have to do that. Even at current efficiency levels, both solar and wind beat coal with full carbon capture and storage. So, don't do the pilot plant. You do not wish to demonstrate this to the public. You just tell them you're going to do the pilot plant, and you pull the rug out, and then you do it again, and you pull the rug out, and we poor rubes believe it. One more. As I said in the other room, now you have to wave money. Okay, I spoke of geoengineering as a stopgap solution. Partial, of course, but pretty broad range. Which countries do I think would step up and sort of and do what? And lead the funding for it.
And would it be the U.S. given their economic challenges?
Would it be the U.S.? Would it be the Chinese? I think the U.S. will be one of the last countries to do this, as it is the last country to do most things. That's true. They haven't signed the Law of the Sea Treaty yet. 25 years and counting. That your question kind of, I don't know if it implicitly assumes, but it seems to assume that this is expensive. And it isn't. And you don't have to do it from a lot of places around the world. You can do it from one place around the world. The wonderful thing about upper altitude winds is wherever you do it from, it'll be everywhere in a few weeks in the stratosphere. And like I said, the cost is a couple of $2 billion. Liechtenstein has a couple of $1 billion. So the question is not how do we fund this, it's how do we stop rogue players from funding it themselves a bit early, maybe with technology we don't trust. And that is a problem from hell. I mean, you want to see us screw up, that's where we're likely to screw up. I mean, I do think this is the best way through this. But the more I think about it, and I'm doing a piece on it right now, sort of large investigative piece, and the deeper I get into it, the more horrifically complex the deal-making that would have to ensue if you're not going to have overt conflict. How much geoengineering do we do? Who's done the testing? Do we trust them? Which technique are you going to use? Can we supervise it too, please, because we don't trust you? It's a cat's cradle of potential conflicts. But, you know, the short answer is it doesn't need joint funding. It would be good to have it joint funded because that would imply some level of global agreement about what we actually do and how much and how soon. And so we should work for that. But it's not because there's a shortage of money. Thank you very much.